Hello students, hope you all are fine. Welcome to the 10th standard social science class. Today we are going to read about the making of a global world. But before starting the class, as usual, I want you to get ready with a pen and a book to note down the important points while we are going through this important chapter. So are you ready, children? So before starting this class, I want to give a brief introduction about the making of a global world. So when we talk about globalization, we often refer to an economic system that has emerged since the last 6 decades or so. But the making of a global world has a long history of trade, of migration of people in search of work, the movement of capital, and much else. As we think about the dramatic and visible signs of global interconnectedness in our lives today, we need to understand the phases through which this world in which we live has emerged. All through history, human societies have become steadily more interlinked. From ancient times, travelers, traders, priests, and pilgrims traveled vast distances for knowledge, opportunity, and spiritual fulfillment or to escape persecution. They carried goods, money, values, skills, ideas, inventions, and even germs and diseases. As early as 3000 BCE, an active coastal trade linked the Indus Valley civilization with present-day West Asia. For more than a millennia, the Kuris, the Hindi Kauri or seashells used as a form of currency from the Maldives found their way to China and East Africa. The long distance spread of disease-carrying germs may be traced as far back as 7th century. By the 19th century, it had become an unmistakable link. So we're going to really read something about the global world now, the meaning exactly to tell. In today's world, every aspect of our lives is having influence of many parts of the world. Most of the household items we are using are being manufactured by some multinational companies. The Coke, which we drink, is actually imported from the USA. The Hyundai car is from Korea. Suzuki is from Japan, selling cars under Maruti's banner. So by globalization, as we read in the previous class some time ago, by globalization we mean increased integration between different economies of the world. How is this achieved? This is achieved with removal of barriers on free flow of goods, services and capital between nations. Silk routes. So we are going to see what are the silk routes, what is their meaning, where do they exist now. Clear? So the silk routes are a good example of a vibrant pre-modern trade and cultural links between distant parts of the world. The name Silk Routes points to the importance of westbound Chinese silk cargoes along this route. Historians actually have identified several silk routes over land and by sea, knitting together vast regions of Asia and linking Asia with Europe and Northern Africa. They are known to have existed since before the Christian era and thrived almost till the 15th century. But Chinese pottery also traveled the same route, as did textiles and spices from India and Southeast Asia. In return, precious metals like gold and silver followed from Europe to Asia. Trade and cultural exchange always went hand in hand. Early Christian missionaries almost certainly traveled this route to Asia as did early Muslim preachers a few centuries later. Much before all this, Buddhism emerged from eastern India and spread in several directions through intersecting points on the Silk routes. So let us see what are Silk routes now, a brief thing. The name Silk routes points to the importance of westbound Chinese silk cargoes along this route. So historians have identified several silk routes over land and by sea, knitting to the vast regions of Asia and linking Asia with Europe and Northern Africa. Trade and cultural exchange always went hand in hand via these silk routes. Okay, this is a small map to depict the silk routes of Asia especially. Okay, you can see the red and blue lines here. So those are the silk routes. So now we are going to see about travel of food. So food travels, spaghetti and potatoes. Let us see what are those. Food offers many examples of long distance cultural exchange. Traders and travelers introduce new crops to the lands they travel. I mean to say, wherever they travel, they introduce the new food over there. Even ready foodstuff in distant parts of the world might share common origins. Take for example, spaghetti and noodles. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Or perhaps Arab traders took pasta to 5th century Sicily, an island now in Italy. Similar foods were also known in India and Japan, so the truth about their origin may never be known. Yet, such guesswork suggests that possibilities of long distance cultural contact even in the pre-modern world. Many of our common foods which we use even today, like potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes and so on, were not known to our ancestors until about 5 centuries ago. These foods were only introduced in Europe and Asia after Christopher Columbus accidentally discovered the vast continent that would later become known as the Americas. Here, we will use America to describe North America, South America and the Caribbean. In fact, many of our common foods came from America's original inhabitants, the American Indians. Sometimes, the new crops could make the difference between life and death. Europe's poor began to eat better and live longer with the introduction of the humble potato. Ireland's poorest peasants became so dependent on potatoes that when disease destroyed the potato crop in the mid-1840s, hundreds of thousands died of starvation. So potato was the main crop at the time. So as we have read, traders and travelers introduced new crops to the lands wherever they travel. Even ready foodstuff in distant parts of the world might share a common origin. Take for example spaghetti and noodles. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Many of our common foods such as potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes and so on were not known to our ancestors, as I told you, for about 5 centuries ago. These foods were only introduced in Europe and Asia after Christopher Columbus accidentally discovered the vast continent that was later to be known as the Americas. So you can see the food over here, different packets, okay, of food. So we are going to see about the conquest, disease and trade now. Conquest, disease and trade. The pre-modern world shrank greatly in the 16th century after European sailors found a sea route to Asia and also successfully crossed the Western Ocean to America. For centuries before, the Indian Ocean had known a bustling trade with goods, people, knowledge, customs, etc., crisscrossing its waters. The Indian subcontinent was central to these flows and a crucial point in their networks. The entry of the European helped expand or redirect some of these flows towards Europe. Before its discovery, America had been cut off from regular contact with the rest of the world for millions of years. But from the 16th century, its vast lands and abundant crops and minerals began to transform trade and lives everywhere. Precious metals, particularly silver, from mines located in present-day Peru and Mexico also enhanced Europe's wealth and financed its trade with Asia. Legends spread in 17th century Europe about South America's fabled wealth. Many expeditions set off in search of El Dorado, the fabled city of gold. The Portuguese and Spanish conquest and colonization of America was decisively underway by the mid-16th century. European conquest was not just a result of superior firepower. In fact, the most powerful weapon of Spanish conquerors was not a conventional military weapon at all. It was the germs, such as those of smallpox, that they carried on their persons. Because of their long isolation, America's original inhabitants had no immunity against these diseases that came from Europe. Smallpox in particular proved a deadly killer. Once introduced, it spread deep into the continent ahead even of any European reaching there. It killed and decimated whole communities, paving the way for conquest. So John Withrow, he has written about biological war. The first government of Massachusetts, Bay Colony, New England, wrote in May 1634 that smallpox signaled God's blessing for the colonists. The natives were Nera, all dead of smallpox, so as the Lord had cleared out title to what we possess. So guns could be bought or captured and turned against the invaders, but not diseases such as smallpox, to which the conquerors were mostly immune. Until the 19th century, poverty and hunger were common in Europe. Cities were crowded with deadly diseases were widespread, religious conflicts were common, and religious dissenters were persecuted. Thousands therefore fled Europe for America. Here by the 18th century, plantations worked by slaves captured in Africa were growing cotton and sugar for European markets. Until, in the 18th century, China and India were among the world's richest countries. They were also preeminent in Asian trade. However, from the 15th century, China is said to have restricted overseas contacts and retreated into isolation. China's reduced role and rising importance of the Americas gradually moved the center of world trade westwards. Europe now emerged as the center of world trade. So we are going to brief this now. In the 16th century, European sailors found a sea route to Asia and also successfully crossed the Western Ocean to America. For centuries before that, the Indian Ocean had known a bustling trade with goods, people, knowledge, customs, etc., crisscrossing in waters. The Indian subcontinent was central to these flows and a crucial point in their networks. The most powerful weapon of Spanish conquerors was not a conventional military weapon at all. It was smallpox, which was carried from one person to another. Because of the long isolation, America's original inhabitants had no immunity against these diseases that came from Europe. Smallpox in particular proved as a deadly killer. So there were some dramatic changes which occurred in the 19th century, children. We are going to see this now. So the 19th century, particularly in between 1815 to 1940 is the period which we are referring now. The world changed profoundly in the 19th century. Economic, political, social, cultural and technological factors interacted in complex ways to transform societies and reshape external relations. Economists identify three types of movement or flows within international economic exchanges. The first, listen children, is the flow of trade, which in the 19th century and referred largely to trade in goods, for example, cloth and wheat. The second is the flow of labor, the migration of people in search of employment. The third is the movement of capital for short-term or long-term investment over long distances. You should remember these 3 points, children. Okay, flow of trade, flow of labor and flow of capital. The capital can be for short-term or long-term investments. All these three flows were closely interwoven and affected people's lives more deeply now than ever before. The interconnections could sometimes be broken. For example, labor migration was often more restricted than goods or capital flows. Yet, it helps us understand the 19th century world economy better if we look at the following flows. Let us see in detail. So there was another change over here. A world economy takes shape. A good place to start is the changing pattern of food production and consumption in industrial Europe. We'll see what happened traditionally at that point of time. Okay? So world economy actually changed at that time. Traditionally, countries like to be self-sufficient in food. But in the 19th century, self-sufficiency in food meant lower living standards and social conflict, and we are going to see why was this so. Population growth from the late 18th century had increased the demand for food grains in Britain. As urban centers expanded and industry grew, the demand for agricultural products went up, pushing up food grain prices. Under pressure from landed groups, the government also restricted the import of corn. The laws allowing the government to do this were commonly known as the Corn Laws. Okay, we are going to see the Corn Laws now. Okay, the laws allowing the government to do this were commonly known as Corn Laws. Unhappy with high food prices, industrialists and urban dwellers forced the abolition of Corn Laws. After the Corn Laws were scrapped, food could not be imported into Britain more cheaply than it could be produced within the country. British agriculture was unable to compete with imports. Vast areas of land were now left uncultivated and thousands of men and women were thrown out of work. They flocked to the cities or migrated overseas. As food prices fell, consumption in Britain rose. From the mid-19th century, faster industrial growth in Britain also led to higher incomes and therefore more food imports. Around the world in Eastern Europe, Russia, America and Australia, lands were cleared and food production expanded to meet the British demand. It was not enough merely to clear lands for agriculture. Railways were needed to link the agricultural regions to the ports. New harbors had to be built and old ones expanded to ship the new cargoes. People had to settle on the lands to bring them under cultivation. See the kind of steps they followed, okay? This meant building homes and settlements. All these activities in turn required capital and labor. Capital flowed from financial centers such as London. The demand for labor in places where labor was in short supply, as in Americas and Australia, led to more migration. Nearly 50 million people migrated from Europe to America and Australia in the 19th century. All over the world, some 150 million are estimated to have left their homes, crossed the oceans, and vast distances over land in search of a better future. Thus, by 1890, a global agricultural economy had taken shape, accompanied by complex changes in labor movements patterns. So we are now going to see about the rinderpest or cattle plague. In Africa in the 1890s, a fast spreading disease of cattle plague, a plague we call it, or rinderpest had a terrifying impact on people's livelihoods and the local economy. This is a good example of the widespread European imperial impact on colonized societies. It shows how in this era of conquest, even a disease affecting cattle reshaped the lives and fortunes of thousands of people and their relations with the rest of the world. Historically, Africa had abundant land and a relatively small population. I mean to say, Africa had a lot of land, but population was less over there. For centuries, land and livestock sustained African livelihoods and people rarely worked for a wage. In late 19th century Africa, there were few consumer goods that wages could buy. If you had been an African possessing land and livestock and there was plenty of both, you too would have seen little reason to work for wage. I mean to say that during that part of time in Africa, nobody used to work because there was plenty of land and there was agricultural produce also. In the late 19th century, Europeans were attracted to Africa due to its vast resources of land and minerals. Europeans came to Africa hoping to establish plantations and mines to produce crops and minerals for export to Europe. But there was an unexpected problem, a shortage of labor willing to work for wages. Employers used many methods to recruit and retain labor. Heavy taxes were imposed which could be paid only by working for wages on plantations and mines. Inheritance laws were changed so that peasants were displaced from land. Only one member of a family was allowed to inherit land, as a result of which the others were pushed into the labor market. Mine workers were also confined in compounds and not allowed to move about freely. Then came rinderpest, a devastating cattle disease. This is very important from the examination point of view, children. Rinderpest or cattle plague. Okay, rinderpest arrived in Africa in the late 1880s. It was carried by infected cattle imported from British Asia. It was from British Asia to feed the Italian soldiers invading entirely in East Africa. Entering Africa in the east, rinderpest moved west like forest fire, reaching Africa's Atlantic coast in 1892. It reached the Cape, Africa's southernmost tip, 5 years later. Along the way, rinderpest killed 90% of the cattle. See how devastating it was. Okay, the loss of cattle destroyed African livelihoods. Planters, mine owners, and colonial governments now successfully monopolized what scarce cattle resources remained to strengthen their power and to force Africans into the labor market. Control over the scarce resources of the cattle enabled European colonizers to conquer and subdue Africa. Similar stories can be told about the impact of Western conquest on other parts of the 19th century world. So a brief thing about rinderpest. So rinderpest was a disease which arrived in Africa in the late 1880s. It was carried by infected cattle imported from British Asia to feed the Italian soldiers invading Eritrea in East Africa. Eastern Africa in the east. Rinderpest moved west like a forest fire. The loss of cattle destroyed African livelihoods. Planters, mine owners, and colonial governments now successfully monopolized what scarce cattle resources remain to strengthen their power and to force Africans into the labor market. So with this, we come to this particular class of the making of a global world. Do read the lesson at home, children, and complete your homeworks in time. Thank you.